Good evening, and thank you for joining the Grace City Opera Theater. Tonight's tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. will take us on a journey through music and oration, a look at his life and legacy, the goals and ideals, and the gifts that he left to all of us, that he left to this entire world, that we practice even today and that we hold dear in our hearts. A kinder, peaceful, loving world where we are judging one another by the content of our character and not the color of our skin, where we are embracing the gifts and talents that each and every one of us has, where we are embracing the individuality of each person, no matter what nationality, no matter what race, no matter what ethnicity. We certainly hope that you enjoy tonight's program. Martin Luther King Jr., born Michael King Jr., January 15, 1929, was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the modern civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. King is best known for advancing civil rights through nonviolence and civil disobedience. Inspired by his Christian beliefs and the nonviolent activism of Mahatma Gandhi, he was the son of early civil rights activist Martin Luther King Sr. King participated in and led marches for blacks' right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights. King led the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott and later became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As president of the SCLC, he led the unsuccessful Albany movement in Albany, Georgia, and helped organize some of the nonviolent 1963 protests in Birmingham, Alabama. Most notably to me is June 23, 1963, the 20th anniversary of the 1943 Detroit race riot. Detroit walked to freedom. This march was attended by more than 125,000 people, including community leaders, ministers, and even the Detroit mayor. Among those attending this march was my father, Claude Merrill Jr. He too was a fighter and warrior for the civil rights of all people, as well as being an active member of the AFGE AFL CIO Union. After this march, the attendees gathered in Cobo Hall. The keynote speaker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was here that we first heard the I Have a Dream speech. Oh, what a time, my father said. Oh, what a time. What was it like, I asked him. He said, well, my daughter, you're much too young to remember. But I knew when I heard that speech, I knew when I met Dr. King, I knew all through the day that this nation was coming to a new awakening. I knew that this man was bringing us a message that we must all take in, that we must all embrace, the message of love, tolerance, and embracing each individual for who they are, embracing them for their gifts, their talents, and everything they have to bring to the world, no matter what color their skin, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their nationality, no matter their gender. Each and every one of us is important, and each and every one of us brings something to give. We must learn to love and live in peace. Get along with one another. That is the only way we will succeed in having a peaceful world, an accepting world, where all people are judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. Oh, it was a great day. What a time, what a time. Oh, yes, what a time. But this would not be the last. Once again, in August 1963, when organizer Asa Philip Randolph invited Dr. Martin Luther King to be the keynote speaker at the historic March on Washington, once again, America would hear the I Have a Dream speech. Oh, what a time. Oh, what a time. The SCLC put into practice the tactics of nonviolent protests with some success by strategically choosing the methods and places in which the protests were to be carried out. There were several dramatic standoffs with segregationist authorities who sometimes turned violent. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover considered King a radical and made him an object of the FBI's countless investigations from 1963 until his death. FBI agents investigated him for possible communist ties, recorded his every move and goings about, finding no evidence whatsoever of any communist ties. In 1964, J. Edgar Hoover sent King a threatening letter telling him to commit suicide. On October 14, 1964, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. In 1965, he helped to organize 2 of the 3 Selma to Montgomery marches. In his final years, he expanded his focus to include opposition towards poverty, capitalism, and the Vietnam War. In 1968, King was planning a national occupation of Washington, D.C., to be called the Poor People's Campaign. However, before it was to happen, on April 4, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
In 1948, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. earned a sociology degree from Morehouse College. He also attended Theological Seminary School in Chester, Pennsylvania. He thrived in all his studies and was valedictorian of his class in 1951. He was also elected student body president and earned a fellowship for graduate study. During his last year in seminary, King came under the guidance of Morehouse College president Benjamin E. Mays, who influenced King's spiritual development. Mays was an outspoken advocate for racial equality and encouraged King to view Christianity as a potential force for social change. After being accepted to several colleges for his doctoral study, Dr. King enrolled in Boston University. In 1954, while still working on his dissertation, King became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He completed his Ph.D. and earned his degree in 1955. King was only 25 years old.
We can mark the beginning of the modern civil rights movement with the U.S. Supreme Court decision banning school segregation, or the day in 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to move from the bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, inspiring the Montgomery bus boycott. The end to this movement is marked by the passing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act or the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Today we are told the story of the modern civil rights movement, often referred to as the Civil Rights Movement, as bad things happening to innocent African Americans wanting to live the American dream, but due to the beliefs of individual racist men, this was met with violence in order to suppress the African American community. The story goes on to say that the individual actions of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and the federal government solved this problem and racism in America ended. This, of course, is not the true story. Segregation is defined benignly and glosses over the ways in which northern and southern state governments and businesses systematically reinforced white supremacy ideology through several decades of violence. The laws and practices that affected African Americans during this era of American history also affected other groups of marginalized people who are seldom mentioned in the textbook story of civil rights. These groups include Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, Native Alaskans, Jews, and Arabs. All of these omissions from the history of the modern civil rights movement strip away the underlying motivation for the collective anger and social action that sparked the modern civil rights movement, and many Americans never learn the true history of the movement. Today, as we reflect on the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., let us remember that the fight for equal rights in America is a battle that was not won due to the actions of the individual, but through the collective struggle and perseverance of marginalized communities and continues to this day. Martin Luther King Jr. became a national figure through his leadership in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. The boycott took off after 2 incidents of African American women refusing to give up their bus seats to a white man. The first occurrence was in March of 1955 when Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old girl, refused to give up her seat and violated Jim Crow law and was arrested. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People sought to challenge segregated public busing in Montgomery, and King was on the committee that looked into the case, and it was decided that the committee would wait for a different case to challenge this law due to the incident involving a minor. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus, and this was the case that the committee would use to challenge the law. This led to a boycott of the Montgomery public busing, which lasted 385 days. The campaign concluded with the U.S. District Court ruling in Bowder v. Gale and ended the legal segregation of all Montgomery public buses. In 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded by several civil rights activists including Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Joseph Lowery. This group was created to establish a moral authority and organizing power of Black churches in order to conduct nonviolent protests for civil rights reform. The SCLC's prayer pilgrimage for freedom in 1957 was the first time King addressed a national audience. Through the SCLC, the Gandhi Society for Human Rights was founded, and King served as honorary president. This group was established to help cover legal suits such as the libel case New York Times Company versus Sullivan, as well as assisting the nonviolent movement with effective means of fundraising. The group began to pressure President Kennedy in 1962 to issue an executive order to boost civil rights in America, a second Emancipation Proclamation. However, Kennedy did not execute this order. King led the SCLC until his death in 1968 and was able to organize and lead marches for the right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights, and the organization's activism was successful in enacting most of these rights into law with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Upon his return to Atlanta in 1958, Georgia Governor Ernest Van Diver was openly hostile towards King, and on May 4th, 1960, King was stopped by police and cited for driving without a license due to not being issued a Georgia license. Though his Alabama license was still valid and the Georgia law didn't mandate any time limit for issuing a local license, King paid a fine and was given a plea deal that included a probationary sentence. King became involved in organizing sit-ins with the Atlanta student movement in order to desegregate businesses and public spaces in the city. In August of 1960, King was asked to sit in a mass sit-in that would take place in October, which intended to highlight the lack of discussion on civil rights issues in the 1960 presidential election. During a sit-in on October 19th, King, along with other protesters, were arrested. However, King was held and charged with violating his probation plea deal and was sentenced to 4 months of hard labor, and the next day was transported from a county jail to a maximum security state prison. His arrest and harsh sentencing gained national attention, and many feared for his safety as he was in a prison facility with many white and hostile inmates who opposed his activism. Both presidential candidates were asked to weigh in on the situation, and this led to Kennedy pressing Governor Vandiver and Robert Kennedy to pressure state authorities to release King, which proved effective, leading to Martin Luther King Sr. to endorse John F. Kennedy for president. After this, a 30-day truce was declared in Atlanta in order for desegregation negotiations to take place. But when these failed, the sit-ins and boycotts continued until March 7, 1961, when a compromise was reached and the city's lunch counters would desegregate in fall of 1961, in conjunction with the desegregation of schools. In December of 1961, Dr. King and the SCLC became involved in the Albany Movement, a desegregation coalition. The movement mobilized thousands of citizens in a broad, nonviolent attack on every aspect of segregation in Albany, Georgia. King visited on December 15, 1961, only expecting to stay a few days to give counsel and then return home, but he was swept into a mass arrest of peaceful demonstrators the following day. King was given the choice of 45 days in jail or a large fine. He chose jail, but it was arranged by the chief of police to release him discreetly 3 days into his sentence. The movement went on for nearly a year of intense activism, but the movement began to deteriorate. The Albany movement proved to be a lesson in tactics for the modern civil rights movement, and the subsequent media criticism of King and the SCLC led to a rift between the Southern Christian Leadership Committee and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who had been supporting the movement in Albany. This led to King focusing on SCLC movements rather than entering pre-existing movements. In 1963, the SCLC began the Birmingham Campaign Against Segregation and Injustice. This campaign used tactics developed by Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, which used nonviolent protest in an intentionally confrontational approach. This led to protesters occupying public spaces in nonviolent ways, such as marches and sit-ins. The intention was to openly violate laws the campaign stated were unjust. King's intent was to provoke mass arrest in order to open up negotiations and shut down the city. These tactics were not successful in these goals and were met with national media criticism. It wasn't until the protesters were met with violence that these tactics became successful. During these protests, the Birmingham Police Department used water jets and dogs against protesters. Footage of the police brutality gained national attention and dominated national news. This footage exposed white Americans to the violence committed against the Black community. Though the national media was quick to criticize King and the SCLC, the protests were successful. The Jim Crow signs came down in the city and public spaces became more open for African Americans. During this campaign, King composed the Letter from Birmingham Jail after his 13th arrest. The letter called the movement to not exclusively pursue legal channels for social change and argued that racism was too entrenched in the current system. The March on Washington was organized by Asa Philip Randolph, who invited many organizations, including Southern Christian Leadership Committee, the National Associations for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Urban League, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Congress of Racial Equality. The march was supported by President Kennedy, who worked to involve additional church leaders such as Walter Reuther, who was president of the United Automobile Workers. These leaders helped mobilize demonstrators, ensuring the turnout would be large enough to make a significant impact on the American people and dramatize the dehumanizing condition of African Americans in the South. The march made the demands to end racial segregation in public schools, promote meaningful civil rights legislation, including laws against racial discrimination in employment, protections of civil rights workers from police brutality, a $2 minimum wage for all workers, and self-government for Washington, D.C. The march was successful, and 250,000 people of all races attended and was the largest gathering of protesters in Washington, D.C.'s history at the time. In March 1964, the SCLC joined forces with Robert Haling's movement in St. Augustine, Florida. The movement was previously affiliated with the NAACP, however, were forced out of the group due to the movement advocating armed self-defense along with non-violent tactics. The SCLC accepted the group and worked to bring Northern activists to St. Augustine, which included a delegation of rabbis and the 72-year-old mother of the governor of Massachusetts, who were all arrested. In June 1964, the movement marched nightly through the city and faced counter-demonstrations by the Klan, who provoked violence that garnered national attention. During this movement, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Despite the national success of the movement, protesters continued to face violence from the Klan, and the SCLC continued to give the movement financial support after leaving in July of 1964. In 1964, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee worked on voter registration in Selma, Alabama, and were joined by the SCLC in December. The groups led a march in March of 1965 to Montgomery and were met by police violence and made the racism of Alabama nationwide. The group made several attempts to march on the state capitol, the first attempt on March 7th being unsuccessful due to the protesters being met with a mob and police violence. This march was organized by Amelia Boynton and other group leaders. When the marchers passed a county line, they were attacked by state troopers and county possemen with clubs and tear gas. This became known as Bloody Sunday. The second attempt took place on March 9th, and when marchers passed the county line, state troopers stepped aside to allow them to pass. That night, a group of white demonstrators attacked and murdered activist James Reeb, who had come from Boston to march with the second group. The backlash of the violence of Bloody Sunday and the murder of James Reeb resulted in a national outcry and sparked acts of civil disobedience that targeted the Alabama and federal government. Protesters demanded the safety of the Selma marchers and the passing of a federal voting rights law to allow African Americans to register to vote without harassment. The third march started on March 21st, and while Governor Wallace refused to provide protection for marchers, President Johnson ordered the Alabama National Guard, FBI agents, and federal marshals to protect the group. The march continued until protesters reached the Alabama state capitol on March 25th, and King delivered the speech, "How long? Not long." The Voting Rights Act was later passed in August of 1965. In 1966, King, along with Ralph Abernathy, moved to Chicago in the slums of North Lawndale to educate and demonstrate their support and empathy for the poor. The SCLC formed a coalition with the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations in an effort to expose discriminatory housing practices in Chicago. This was done through testing several white couples and black couples who matched in income, background, number of children, and other attributes, finding couples were subjugated to racial steering. Several marches were executed to protest these practices, but King and Abernathy found that they were received worse in Chicago than in the South. The Marquette Park March on August 5th was met with thrown bottles and verbal harassment, as well as the possibility of the march transitioning into a riot. The marches continued to be met with violence, King being hit with a brick during one of the demonstrations. King was a longtime opponent to the Vietnam War, but avoided speaking publicly on these views in order to avoid interference with his work on civil rights goals. On April 4th, 1967, King delivered a speech at an appearance at the New York City Riverside Church, in which he spoke against the U.S.'s role in the war. King stated that the U.S. was in Vietnam to occupy it as an American colony and called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. King's opposition to the war stemmed from the amount of money and resources being funneled into the military that could have been spent on social welfare for American people. This opposition cost him support from white allies such as President Johnson, union leaders, and publishers. King criticized the double standard of his nonviolence being applauded at home, but demonized when applied to the Vietnamese. In 1968, King and the SCLC organized the Poor People's Campaign to address the issue of economic injustice. King traveled the country in order to assemble a multiracial army of the poor to march on Washington and engage in civil disobedience. This march would continue in the Capitol until Congress created an Economic Bill of Rights for poor Americans. King and the SCLC called on the federal government to invest in rebuilding American cities and felt that Congress had shown hostility to the poor by spending large amounts of money and resources on the military while ignoring the economic issues of poor Americans. King's vision was for a revolutionary change to the systematic flaws of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism instead of mere reforms to the system, and argued that the real issue was reconstruction of society itself. On March 29, 1968, King went to Memphis, Tennessee to support Black sanitary public works employees in their strike for higher wages and better workplace treatment. King gave a speech at a rally for this movement. His speech, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," would be the last speech he gave. On April 4th, King stayed at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis with Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson. King was scheduled to appear at an event that evening and spoke to Ben Branch before stepping out on the balcony. He said, "Ben, make sure you play 'Take My Hand, Precious Lord' in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot by James Earl Ray at 6:01 p.m. while standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me onward we stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, bring me near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call. Hold my hand lest I fall.
The legacy of Martin Luther King lives on to this day. We can see his influences throughout the 20th century with the Black Consciousness Movement and Civil Rights Movement in South Africa, as well as the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement in the United Kingdom. In the United States, King has become a national icon in the history of American liberalism and American progressivism. The holiday we're observing today was established in 1971 in cities such as St. Louis, Missouri. It wasn't until 2000 that every state in the United States celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the last being Utah, that previously celebrated the holiday at the same time but under the name Human Rights Day. Martin Luther King Jr.'s influences live on today. His 1968 Poor People's Campaign has been revived. Today, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has picked up this unfinished work. From Alaska to Arkansas, the Bronx to the border, people are coming together to confront the interlocking evils of systematic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism in the war economy, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. The campaign states an understanding that the nation is at a critical juncture, that we need a movement that will shift the moral narrative, impact policies and elections at every level of government, and build lasting power for poor and impacted people. If you are interested in more information on the Poor People's Campaign, please visit their website listed below.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. All along my pilgrim's journey, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me. In my trials, Lord, walk with me. In my trials, Lord, walk with me. When the shades of life are falling, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me. In my sorrows, Lord, walk with me. In my sorrows, Lord, walk with me. When my heart within is aching, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me.
Thank you for joining us this evening for our Martin Luther King Jr. Day concert. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and if you are interested in future presentations by the Gray City Opera Theater, please subscribe to our channel and visit our website and Facebook page for future concerts and works. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this evening's journey through the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Finally, as we close this evening's program, I invite you to join us in singing Lift Every Voice and Sing. Thank you again and enjoy your evening.